if you want to formulate it in classical Marxist terms, would be that all the promise of bourgeois nationhood is rent apart by the divide between labor and capital. So it's the divide between labor and capital that pulls apart the nation. And the wager of classical Marxism is that the nation is restored and emancipated through the process of putting the proletariat in power. The proletariat constitutes itself the nation and brings about the emancipation of all citizens, of all people in that process.
Please like, share, and subscribe.
Mobilize your workers from your slumber. All you wage slaves, everyone.
The revolution comes like thunder, and the age of hypocrisy is done.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Class Unity Transmissions. I'm joined today by my co-host, David Feldman, and with us is our guest, Philip Cunliffe. Philip is Associate Professor of International Relations at UCL, and more importantly, for the purposes of our episode today, he is the author of the book National Interest, Politics After Globalization. You may be familiar with his voice, however. He is the co-founder and contributing editor to the podcast Bunga Podcast, or Bunga Pod, used to be known as Aufhebunga, and I'm still in the habit myself of calling it that. Well, Phil, we're really glad to have you on to discuss this book. It's very provocative. I think everyone will find something in here to discuss and debate. You take a lot of shots in a lot of different directions, and there's a very interesting cohesive thread that runs through the whole thing. So let's just get right into it. When people on the left generally think about something called the national interest, it's safe to say, I think the consensus would be this concept does not have a good reputation among them, right? So you can also throw into that, I think, elements of the libertarian right. Certainly here in the United States, the national interest is looked on with scorn by the libertarian right. But you conclude with this book with the suggestion that we should seek to, and this sort of sounds almost like the Trump phrase, make America great again. You're kind of arguing here that we should seek to make political life meaningful again by means of this concept of the national interest. So maybe we could just start there. What is the national interest? And what is this specific problem of political life that you're trying to address with this book?
Thanks, Nick and Dave, and delighted to be on the pod and to have the opportunity to talk about the book. So thank you. What I offer in the book is the national interest, not as a thing, but as a way of doing politics. So I think the idea of the national interest as a thing is something inherited from the Cold War. The idea of the national interest as a concrete set of policy prescriptions or habitual reflexes of foreign policy that belongs to an era that is now gone, but stems from the latter half of the 20th century and spills over into the first 15 years, quarter century or so of the 21st century. And I want to suggest that understanding of the national interest is misguided, but also the institutional basis for it, for thinking of the national interest as a thing, that's gone. The political conditions in which the national interest was conflated with national security, and it was essentially a deep state concept, that time is past. So what I propose instead is to think of the national interest as a way of doing politics, which is to say that we fold all that we might wish for or aspire to, whatever it might be, in terms of our political desiderata, aspirations, hopes, whatever, demands, that they all be folded through the prism of national interest. And that's a way of making political life meaningful, not in existential terms. I should clarify, not in the sense that it gives existential satisfaction to people, though it may do, hopefully it should do, if it is indeed meaningful, but rather in that it allows politics to gain traction, to gain meaningful public grip on institutions of government on ruling elites, on fostering political accountability, on strengthening the ties between rulers and ruled. And I think the national interest is primed to do that. And the reason for that is simple, is that the national interest was effectively the nation state in particular, was abandoned as a vehicle for public life, for politics, at least since the end of the First Cold War. So between that era of globalization, between the early 1990s and the 2010s, roughly 2016, 2020, the nation state was degraded, or nation states were seen to be administrative units in this larger global order, and they were all supposed to be aligned, harmonized, and integrated into various international structures that would limit their room for maneuver, limit their scope for political discretion, limit political flexibility, which obviously circumscribes the degree of political freedom that the citizens of those nation states had. So, because ruling elites had abandoned the national interest, we're now in a position in which the national interest can be used as a battering ram for democratic revival, that it can be used as a way for the masses to imprint their demands on the state and on ruling elites, and therefore this is what would make politics meaningful in that sense.
It's all great, fascinating. A lot of things in there that I think we definitely want to come back to, this idea of the national interest as being not a thing, but actually more like a process, a means of doing politics. I also definitely want to come back to, what you say about the Cold War and how the national interest was sort of kind of like morphed into this idea of national security. The national security state bureaucrats, they're the ones who are sort of deciding like what the quote unquote national interest is at this point. And it's just loses its sort of democratic potential there. But I guess I have a question. I wanted to kind of follow up on what you were saying at the end, which I think is also really important. In, I think, the first chapter, you kind of opened talking about the way that the elites, and also the left, the way that the elites and the left have kind of increasingly come to talk of contemporary challenges as global in scope, as a way of sort of abandoning the nation, as it were. And you argue that that discourse has the effect of making it increasingly difficult to hold elites to account. Like there's a sort of severing of the possibility of actually having democratic accountability. And I gotta say, I'm increasingly sympathetic to your view. I am someone who, my background is more, I studied a lot of globalization. I'm wondering if there's a danger, though, of maybe throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because we do live in a system of global capitalism. There are challenges, that are global in nature. Even if, I'm increasingly skeptical of the way that, some people talk about climate change as this like absolute like doomerist perspective, kind of like emergence leads towards like emergency politics. I'm increasingly skeptical of that. But we do still live in a system of global capitalism, right? And I'm wondering if there's a way where we can sort of retain this idea of the national interest and using the political structures of the nation state to hold elites accountable, while at the same time always recognizing that, okay, there are going to be issues that cannot be solved just at the level of the nation state, right? And we can talk about like the bond markets, international bond markets, capital flight, like, how do we sort of go about, or would you agree that we can kind of have this sort of politics at the nation state where we still kind of keep this consciousness of the global challenges that we do face in the globalized nature of capitalism?
Yeah, I would flip it around. I'd say the only chance that we have of intervening meaningfully in terms of shaping global capitalism, or intervening meaningfully in its processes, is through a democratic nation state. And that, I think, has been vindicated by the last 30 years of globalization. The effort to build a global economy that is out of the reach of any kind of steering or manipulation or control in terms of public, in terms of public influence at a very basic level, but also the way in which working class aspirations and working class life, particularly that of the old industrial working class, has been hammered away in the core of the capitalist economy, the old capitalist economy in the Western world. That's very much part of the process through which democratic nation states were curbed. So I'd say the condition of intervening in global capitalism is reviving democratic nation states. It's the only way, in fact, in which there will be any meaningful capacity for shaping outcomes in a way that is beneficial to the majority of people, that meets people's political and public needs. And so, for that reason, it's the precondition. I'd say the national interest is the precondition of intervening at that level. And so, the way I distinguish this in the book is between supranationalism or transnationalism and internationalism. And the classic definition of international cooperation, international solidarity, obviously, the prefix inter means between. So the classical understanding of internationalism was between nations. So embedded in the idea of internationalism was this notion of horizontal, egalitarian, respectful relations, but between independent nation states. So the notion of internationalism presupposed independent sovereign states freely cooperating of their own as part of a practice of their own autonomy, as opposed to supranationalism, which was the cultivation of these structures that were above nation states and aimed to encase them and contain them. And super, obviously, the Latin prefix there meaning above. Or transnationalism, trans meaning cutting across, or kind of an orthogonal process. So it's an opposition to transnationalism and supranationalism that the national interest can be asserted, and I would say is in fact being reasserted. This is I think there's an aspect of the populist revolt in its limited and fumbling way that is an effort to recapture the national interest that will almost inevitably fail. But notwithstanding that, the possibility for meaningful international cooperation, I think, is given in the national interest, which is to say that we would need, obviously, coordination, including, kind of expert technical coordination and regulation on a scale that is that of the globe, but that it requires to be firmly anchored with democratic legitimacy, public input, and oversight and accountability. And it's precisely all of those things that have been lost. And which now, where we have international cooperation and global level challenges inviting such tremendous skepticism from below, from a significant portion of the electorate, if not indeed the majority of electors in democratic countries, see international cooperation in that way. They see globalization as suspect, as part of the conspiracy hatched at Davos, as oligarchic, or as directed by the Chinese Communist Party, alternatively. And all of those various partial views, I think, of skepticism and suspicion from below, they speak to alienation and disenfranchisement that is the result of supranationalism, coordination at that level that has become completely cut off from any anchor in the demos. So the national interest, I think, is the precondition of meaningful international cooperation, of internationalism, classically conceived, and also of meeting those challenges, of which, there are plenty.
Thanks, Phil. So I guess maybe as a follow-on to that, I want to ask if you can talk a little bit more about your argument that the national interest, or rather that your argument for the national interest, to be specific, is sovereigntist, not nationalist. Because we're using the word national interest here a lot, and I think listeners will go, okay, isn't that connected with nationalism? Isn't that connected with the idea of being a nationalist? But you insist that the argument here is sovereigntist, and that might throw people off a little bit. So I just wanted to give you some time to flesh that out, what that means. I'm specifically interested in that you sort of make an ancillary point to that, which is that you're emphasizing that citizens define the national interest. And so that seems to also bring in the question of democracy. So I'm wondering perhaps you can tie this together for us. Can you say more about the distinction, firstly, that you're drawing between sovereignty and nationalism, and why, in your view, this focus on sovereignty is the path to go if we want to advance the cause of democracy? Sort of a two-parter.
Yeah, so the old idea, I think, of the legitimacy of independent statehood is the Wilsonian idea from the start of the 20th century. And this is the notion that you have these pre-existing national communities whose that are in some way bound up in empire or suppressed, oppressed in some way. And so the best way to secure both international freedom and peace is to grant them independence and then encase them in a kind of larger global structure, the League of Nations or the United Nations. And so the equation there goes from pre-existing nationalism to justifying the need for sovereign independence. Whereas my argument doesn't take for granted pre-existing nation states or nations indeed, because I think part of the issue is that those institutions have been so delegitimized and gouged out that there is very little basis to speak in terms of meaningful nations, integrated nations, or nations struggling for independence, but rather that we go from the idea of sovereignty, which is to say the notion that there is the possibility of politics built into the idea of a supreme public authority over a given territory and population. And so it goes from if we are to have any kind of meaningful capacity to intervene politically to assert greater control of our lives, then we need state sovereignty. And if we want state sovereignty, then state sovereignty also comes with nations, which is to say that group of citizens who share a common authority under a common jurisdiction in a territory, and that will inevitably, by virtue of their collective participation in those political and legal processes, begin to share a common political institutional history if they don't already. So I don't follow the Wilsonian understanding whereby sovereignty is justified by reference to nationhood. Rather, nationhood is justified by reference to sovereignty. So it's the disintegration of globalization that throws us back onto the need to recreate independent centers of power, functioning centers of public authority within the jurisdictions within which we live, which is to say, to build up functioning institutions of government, independent statehood. And those require nations. They require political collectivities that see themselves as integrated under the rule of a common authority. So sovereignty to nationhood rather than nationhood to sovereignty.
But do you mind if I just come back a little bit on that, actually, because I'm thinking that surely that wouldn't be in the same breath to say nationalism in the other emerging from nationhood wouldn't exist or doesn't exist. I mean, you account for that, I'm sure. I understand that sort of the normative framework you're working with is from sovereignty, to the national interest. Okay, I grasp that, and I think I get it clearly. But nevertheless, nationalism exists, and I'm just curious how you would account for that in this framework, because obviously sometimes there are going to be instances where cultures of nationalism, for want of a better term, are going to end up taking the reins on this question of the national interest.
I'd say there's national populism, which is a portion of the electorate, larger or smaller, depending on which particular democratic state you're looking at. I would say the experience of having lived through Brexit in Britain over the last 10 years or so. So it's been, Brexit happened in 2020, but it was the vote happened 10 years ago in 2016. And that was really the degree of elite and popular hostility to independent nationhood indicated to me that there is, in fact, there's very slender basis for nationalism as a regnant or hegemonic ideology that helps to cohere elite views or to orient elites in terms of how they structure their interaction. And certainly they don't see it as the basis of their legitimacy. So that was very evident as a result of Brexit in Britain. But also, it's very evident now, I think, in Germany and in France. Germany, perhaps more so. So throughout Europe, I think you still have this deep tension and the deep difficulty that ruling elites have in justifying their rule by reference to nationhood. And with good reason, because obviously, if they justify it by reference to nationalism, then that implies certain accountability to a concrete group of people, which is much more difficult to manage, particularly because they have political and legal rights, than distancing yourself from those people by embedding yourself into these supranational networks where you can always plead that your hands are tied because by virtue of various international agreements, by virtue of needing to be responsible and to show deference and willingness to work with allies and partners and internet cooperation at that level. So I don't think you, I mean, I'm sure there is plenty of, I'm sure there's plenty of strong instinctive patriotism among a broad swathe of the electorate, but that doesn't have meaningful political expression. A lot of it is expressed in terms of mistrust and anger. Some of it is expressed in the form of national populism, but there's also a broad swathe of middle class, I think particularly liberal middle class opinion across the Western world that sees nationalism as intrinsically suspect and as hostile and dangerous and a few steps away from fascism. And so, in that context, I think that we don't have, it's very difficult to talk of, I wouldn't even say nationalism, I'd say even nations. It's difficult to talk of nations in kind of meaningful terms because those political collectivities, people don't, you have broad swathes of the electorate who simply don't, they may carry a passport, but they don't identify themselves in that way. They identify themselves with subnational identity or transnational identity. It might be an ethnic kind of diasporic identity if they're, say, a migrant population. It might be a transnational identity, supranational identity, like loyalty to the European Union, which is significant and powerful among many countries in Europe itself. Or it might be some kind of residual national loyalty, but layered over with all sorts of globalist commitments, human rights, NATO, international solidarity, support for Palestine, globalize the Intifada, whatever it might be. I think there's all sorts of identities either beneath or above, but it's the intermediary layer of the nation that is the most gouged out in terms of political loyalty and identification, even though paradoxically, or in fact, not paradoxically at all, but in fact, exactly why it's precisely at that intermediary level that where most people still have the greatest capacity for political agency, and it's precisely that level which is seen to be the most illegitimate vehicle for expressing political desires, political interests, for expressing the national interest.
That's a good answer. Okay, so I'm going to ask the next question, but I know Dave has a very related question in just a minute. So the next part, I think, of the conversation turns to the question of the left. And many listeners to this show who are familiar with your previous work will know that you have a very specific critique of the left, and that, for example, the Bunga podcast, has become sort of well known for laying out this critique. And the critique generally sort of starts with the concept of the new left and how the new left kind of, in a sense, distanced itself or broke with some of the cherished and fundamental principles that, say, the more traditionally Marxist left has been fighting for. So the question, I suppose, is when it comes to the question of the state, the new left specifically, and I agree with this, this is something we talk a lot about in Class Unity. We actually, Dave specifically, I'm so glad he's with us today because he's one of the gurus on this within Class Unity. But we run a course on Marxist state theory in class unity. And so we're very familiar with the ways in which the New Left is, as you say, skeptical of all state power. I note the use of the word state there. However, you say, interestingly, for Marxists, and I'm quoting here, it's not so much that the nation and national interests were fake, but rather that they should be made real. But I'm a little bit curious about that because, you think about the Communist Manifesto. This is, of course, a well-known terrain for this conversation. Marx, it's almost cliche to say, but he famously notes that our calls on working men of the world to unite, not workers of this nation or that nation. And even as he says in one place within the Communist Manifesto that the proletariat has to kind of constitute itself a nation, he specifies that it's not in the bourgeois sense. So I'm just curious here about this clean distinction, this clean break between the old left and the new left that you're kind of relying on here. Isn't the overall thrust, even in Marx, that the nation itself is a bourgeois form to be overcome rather than reconstructed?
Yeah, so in the classical understanding of Marxism, the proletariat must constitute itself the nation is, in my reading, at least my understanding of it, is that it's the flip side of the idea of working men having no country. They constitute themselves the nation, which is to say, writing in the middle of the 19th century, you have very severe and restrictive property franchises so that the only people who had the vote were people with property. The idea, so the nation was constituted, the idea, the justification for being a citizen, a member of the political community was having property, and Marx's claim is that that is the idea of the nation that should be overturned in that context. The franchise shouldn't be made dependent on ownership of property, but rather those who work should rule. The proletariat should constitute itself the political community. So, with that in mind, it seems to me that old classical understanding of emancipation of the working class as the precondition for establishing new forms of international cooperation is still predicated on the idea of national independence. And in the middle of the 19th century, when Marx formulates this idea of the proletariat constituting itself the nation, it's also seen to connect with struggles for national independence, that they were part of that same process of political ferment, with revolts in Hungary and Poland in particular being the most prestigious and politically significant national revolts that would help lay the ground for a new international order in Europe. So that is, I mean, that version of the old left that gets transmuted in certain ways through the late 19th century debates on imperialism among the Marxist left is, I think, fundamentally different from the way in which the new left came to understand nationhood. So for the new left, I think, and it was more a symptom of their inability to break through to the working class in the post-war period, as well as their own political weaknesses and alienation, and also, I would even go as far as to say their political infantilism, their Oedipal revolt against authority, meant that they never really managed to see that it was in fact about that process of constituting nationhood, of constituting themselves as a new political community, constituting the working class as the political nation. And as a result of that failure, they began to see, so we see the nation as a contrick, something which is just a mystification rather than a aspiration or something, a political collectivity which should be aspired to. So, I mean, my understanding, if you want to formulate it in classical Marxist terms, would be that all the promise of bourgeois nationhood is rent apart by the divide between labor and capital. So it's the divide between labor and capital that pulls apart the nation. And the wager of classical Marxism is that the nation is restored and emancipated through the process of putting the proletariat in power. The proletariat constitutes itself the nation and brings about the emancipation of all citizens, of all people in that process. And that's the thing that the New Left turns away from. So they begin to see the idea of nationhood, the idea of public power, the idea of states themselves simply as artificial, false, and then over time, obviously racist, militaristic, imperialistic, tinged with the Maoism of the 1960s and 1970s. They're irredeemably corrupted organizations, and they turn away from them. They become simply bastions that are to be perpetually revolted against, rather than the idea of conquering political power and reconstituting it. That becomes abandoned. So that would be my. I mean, it's a somewhat lengthy answer, but it is. I think it's a very important shift. And it was something which I think is effaced in that transition between the first half of the 20th century and the 1960s. And it's an important disjuncture between new left and old left, is the way they shift in their understanding of the state. And I'm not sure it's not like there's a single text where you'll find it. It's something which you read off their political experiences, their political critiques, their responses, as well as their theoretical, as well as the theoretical treatises that were created in that time. So it's the political history of a generation, not just a kind of a theoretical crystallization of a particular outlook or view. I hope that makes sense.
We're, I think, largely also on board with that. Like at Class Unity, we tend to have like share the same critique of the new left sort of aversion to state power and to power in general. You said at the end of your last, your last intervention there, you were talking about how the classical Marxist critique of like the national interest is that it's sort of like torn apart by this like contradiction, conflict between capital and labor, and that it is, supposed to be then the working class, the proletariat, which has to sort of like overcome that by constituting itself as the nation. But you also mentioned like at the end of the book, like you say that a revitalization of the national interest would entail political parties and leaders making claims about the interests we all share. And that's on page 151. And that just sort of struck me because it does sort of sound like a politics of consensus, right? But is it not also the case that any sort of mass democratic politics, and I think you would agree with this, is also simultaneously going to involve like fundamentally antagonistic interests, class interests being openly fought over. So I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit more, I don't know, just about that tension between sort of a politics that does sort of gesture towards these like shared interests that like the masses might have, but at the same time recognizing there are fundamentally about like antagonistic class interests being fought over.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think we agree in the basic sense that if we understand politics as a competition for state power, then it is by definition an antagonism based in a common territory over a common public authority, over a common legislative process, over the rights and needs and desires and hopes of a given population in a given territory. So it is deeply antagonistic, but it has to presuppose state sovereignty in order for it to be meaningful, in order for it to have any public grip. And I think that is what globalization, the politics of globalization, has denied us for the last 30 years. It's precisely that ability for political antagonism to be meaningful in the sense that it's political competition over state power, because state power itself is rendered meaningless in the context of globalization. The whole point of globalization was to limit and, at least politically speaking, it was to limit and contain state power, to make it less important, illegitimate, nationalistic. State power itself is a few steps away from fascism. It is needs to be it's inefficient, bureaucratic, slovenly, It needs to be contained from its oversight of the market or involvement in the market in any way. At the same time, it's culturally illegitimate because it demands things of you that it's illegitimate to demand, and because your rights, you have human rights, and you have all these cascade of international, transnational institutions, NATO, the International Court of Justice, the European Union, if you're in the European Union, all these kinds of other supranational, transnational institutions to defend you. So the delegitimization of state sovereignty was integral to the politics of globalization. And as a result of that, it made political competition, displaced political competition into culture wars, making it meaningless. So I don't think antagonism and common interests are it is the precondition of a common political life, in fact. They're not opposed, and they only appear to be opposed as a result of these 30 years of globalization that I think has skewed our understanding of political life. It would have been, I think, immediately comprehensible and familiar to people in generations before the last 30 to 40 years.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. I think I agree with that.
So, Phil, I really wanted to ask you a question about international relations, and there's a whole chapter in this book about realism and how realism, in a sense, gave us the theory of the national interest. Curiously, you present classical realism as emerging as a kind of a response to mass politics intruding into foreign policy. I just wanted to be clear about the kind of causal flow there. So you're suggesting, I think, that mass politics, and I think you're right here, help displace older elite-driven conceptions of what the nation is for. But I was curious about this kind of argument that you sort of see classical realism emerging from that, because I think a lot of people would maybe suggest that realism emerged as a response to mass politics, as a way to kind of manage it or displace it or even insulate foreign policy from mass politics. So I just wonder, because you're making this claim that realism's sort of scientific turn, the birth of international relations, I suppose you could call it in that sense, it reflects popular agency. And I'm just curious how confident you are that that's actually true.
Yes, this is the argument I take from E.H. Carr and to a lesser extent Hans Morgenthau, mid-20th century exponents of the idea of political realism, and both of them make this claim in different ways that it is the emergence of mass politics in the late 19th century that infuses political life with the needs and demands imposed on it by industrial society, by the needs of the industrial working class. And so in this way, it makes politics less contingent, less random, less about the decisions of individual ministers and courtiers and senior diplomats like Bismarck and Metternich, but becomes about deep processes that can be understood in terms of their regularity, their repetition, and how far they express the social and functional needs of industrial society in particular periods. So it is that is in the Carrian sense of realism, by which he means the possibility of a scientific study of international politics, in contrast to the attempt to make mass industrial society fit into what he called the liberal idealism, which was inherited from the 19th century but belonged to an earlier era of the early 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, rather than the 20th century. So, but he also understood it as the beginnings of a scientific account, not the entirety of a scientific account of what world politics might look like. So it was in that sense that I took from I was trying to take the understanding of realism from the source, as it were, the wellspring, rather than later understandings of realism. But notwithstanding that, I take your point that certainly within that very broad theoretical tradition, you can also see aspects of realism that are intended to contain and repress the expression of national interest and the expression of popular mass politics and accountability and so on. But it's interesting, so you say take somebody like Morgenthau, for instance, who's a conservative social democrat, I'd say kind of a second internationalist, a Jewish refugee from a Weimar labor lawyer, Jewish refugee from the Nazis, and tries to establishes himself as a preeminent political scientist in post-war America. But he sees the national interest as a democratic check on these incredibly exuberant cold warriors, these idealistic cold warriors who are committed to this insane global war against communism, which is against, at least according to Morgenthau, against America's national interest in all sorts of ways in fighting the Cold War in the way in which they were. So there is plenty, I think there is plenty, notwithstanding, like you say, that there certainly are aspects of realism, particularly later on in the Cold War, by which it theoretically attempts to contain and limit democratic understandings of the national interest. There is also within that tradition plenty of democratic depth and room for expressing public needs in contrast to elite diplomacy.
Well, thanks. That's an interesting answer. I want to sort of take it now into chapter 3. You say that liberal internationalism didn't so much replace the national interest as kind of dissolve or displace political responsibility, specifically by reframing foreign policy in moral and legal terms. So this is, of course, the birth of the liberal kind of orderism of the post-war era. Many World War II critics would say this was a way, and I guess this is related to the earlier question, right? I'm thinking here specifically of people like, I don't know, Altiero Spinelli, in some ways one of the early architects for a united Europe, a Marxist, famously wrote this text called the Ventotene Manifesto. I don't think I pronounced that correctly, but in about 1941, and specifically kind of argued for the idea of a united Europe as a way of preventing future wars. In your framework, that's described as depoliticization, but I think many would see it as a way of restraining or constraining what was in fact a genuinely problematic tendency, which is the tendency of the sort of the realpolitik dynamic that Europe had been founded on for the previous 100 years or so. So how, in a sense, then does national interest respond? Your argument for the national interest, how does it respond to that? Argue that, in fact, taking responsibility for war requires this constraint.
Yeah, so that era, when you have all of these tremendously hopeful, even utopian ideals, post-war ideals are being concocted, and those that you mention by Spinelli and others, I think he belonged to the Liberty and Justice group of the Italian anti-fascist resistance. And they came up with that while they were in exile on prison islands set up by Mussolini. But there were plenty of others along similar lines, kind of formulated in various resistance cells and organizations across the course of the Second World War. And in this I follow Mark Mazower's account of the era, the historian, the British historian of this period, when there's a deep, intimate connection between the hope for a new kind of international order and national emancipation in one and the same breath. And inevitably, given the fact that the resistance was fighting Nazi occupation in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe as well, they were fighting Nazi occupation throughout the continent. Inevitably, that meant they were claiming the abandoned mantle of patriotism that had been abandoned by industrialists and bankers who had decided that it was easier to cooperate with Nazi occupiers than it was to fight them, and that also the Nazis provided the relief away from trade unions and socialists, because obviously they ruled through martial law or deported agitators and trade unions and working class militants to Nazi camps. So in that context, I think the boundary between what counted as internationalism and nationalism was tremendously porous. And the notion of a new international order was founded on national assertion, on the remaking of nations in the aftermath of war, on ejecting the old collaborationist elites, all the old elites who had rolled over for the Nazis or the fascists in different contexts. So I think that sense of that intimate intertwining between international reordering and hope for greater commonality, bound together with national self-assertion and patriotism, is something that's very distant to us and very difficult to imagine, I think, at the moment. But that, I think, belongs to that earlier era, and is also indeed, I think, reaches, it's has many similarities with the earlier mid-19th century understandings of nationalism and internationalism that we spoke about with reference to the Communist Manifesto. The notion of popular national revolt mixing with the idea of reconstituting international orders by the very process of remaking nations and internal national renewal. I think what happens is that that hope, that kind of utopian energy, is partly kidnapped or confiscated in a sense by technocratic elites in the aftermath of the Second World War, as you get stabilization, compromises of various kinds, not least led by the communist parties under the tutelage of Uncle Joe in Moscow, and various sorts of maneuvers and defeats and setbacks, and also just exhaustion, missteps and what have you, that a lot of that energy gets bound up with a very technical process of collaboration that was in the interests of industrialists and the containment of national aspirations. And also in that process, delegitimizing, it begins the very slow but insuperable kind of logic of delegitimizing nationhood as part of the process of European integration, and it gains greater and greater cumulative weight over that period. That you end by the time that you end by the end of the 20th century, independent nationhood itself is seen as a few steps away from fascism, and needing to be contained and repressed and bound up with all of these kind of international obligations. So the story is a little bit different, I think, in the United States, for obvious reasons. I mean, not least not being occupied by, by having any history of occupation. But the broad thrust tends to be the same, that independent nationhood is seen as suspect because it means giving weight to powerful democratic feelings that can't be easily contained.
Excellent. I find this really fascinating. One of the strengths of the book, in my view, is just like all of the history that you do give, in terms of like understanding the theory of the national interest, and I found that very helpful for the argument that you're trying to make about the present day and contemporary politics. And I guess it's time that we maybe sort of start transitioning to like some of the arguments that you make in the last chapter, and then the epilogue. And there's a part where you start to critique the emergence of basically some new theorists who start to talk about the national interests, but you argue that they do this on sort of instrumentalist and pragmatic or pragmatist grounds. This is, I guess, Levin and Roderick, not people I'm familiar with. But I wanted to maybe like sit for a second with this question of instrumentalism in particular and how it relates to the national interest. As I understand it, you're critical of the fact that they sort of seem to be like, okay, we tried globalism, that, did not work, right? So we have to, just because there's nothing left, we have to sort of use nations, the national interest, as sort of a means of doing politics. But you have this critique, you like critique it on that instrumentalist grounds. So what kind of struck me is that the core thesis of your book, like as I understand it, I mean, I'll just read this one sentence from page 147. I think it's like the second to last sentence of the second to last chapter. But you say, framing our political aspirations and goals in terms of the national interest is the means by which we can reforge political connections within atomized societies instead of the effort of renewing our countries. And I largely agree with that. And my question is, though, is that not ultimately also like sort of an instrumental approach to the national interest? Is that it's vital because it provides the best mechanism to achieve these larger aims? So like, would is there something wrong with an instrumentalist approach to the national interest? Is it more the particular way that these other authors kind of talk about it that you've kind of find unsatisfying? I don't know if that made
Yeah,
sense.
no, it does. Yeah, it's more the latter, which is to say, Danny Roderick, he's a Turkish American economist, and he's been a long-term critic of globalization as for its successes and what he calls hyperglobalization. And so he provides a case for political economy in the aftermath of globalization, in which you have separate nation states, but he sees these as repositories of kind of institutional diversity around which you can have profitable arbitrage. So you have different legal regimes, and capitalists profit by identifying the differences between these different jurisdictions by which you have the possibility laid for the kind of diversity that capitalism is so effective at taking advantage of in order to become more efficient. And so this is kind of, you just work through this complex evolutionary scheme of all these different independent nation states, and that is a more effective way to manage global capitalism rather than to have this kind of single coordinated monolith, coordinated from a center. So he sees the nation state as a fallback. We've got to kind of retreat from the excesses of globalization and retreat back to these independent nation states, which have all this institutional and regulatory diversity, for better or for worse, because different populations desire different things, and that's fine. And capitalism, will adapt to that. And so Anatol Levin, by contrast, he's somebody who's very concerned about the need for finding the kind of public legitimacy to tackle the challenges of climate change. And he says globalization has failed to do this. And so we need a kind of realism, a climate realism that's also based on independent nation states. And it's the only place in which you can legitimately manufacture the kinds of compromises by which people will have to take hits for adaptation to the costs of climate change. So because of the tax base that's available through the nation state and the legitimacy that's still available through there, it makes it easier to redistribute the costs of climate change in a way that globalization never allowed. So I use those two thinkers, though there's much to commend. Both of them kind of, there's lots about their ideas that is attractive and commendable, but they seem to me to both frame the nation state and the national interest that comes with it as a fallback. It's kind of, we have to retreat from these excesses and fall back to these ramparts and hold those ramparts. Whereas I see the national interest more as a surging forward, something closer, in fact, to the kinds of ideas where patriotic self-assertion leads to political creation at once, a kind of recreation of one's nation and a recreation of the international order at the same time, something which is closer to the mid-20th century vision of nationalism, internationalism than we have today. So I see the national interest as a way of expressing political creativity, not as a regrettable or unavoidable thing we just have to accept because we've exhausted these other options. So I see it as a more hopeful thing. And so I think it has this idea of the national interest is it's a way in which everyone, because it's a if everyone, I think if every person who has any kind of political aspiration can frame their hopes, whether it's kind of for improving local public services right up to remaking their states, if they can frame their hopes and aspirations in terms of the national interest, that seems to me to potentially unlock a tremendous reservoir of democratic power that's been absent from Western political life for a very long time. So I see it as supercharging political life, not as this regrettable kind of defensive maneuver which needs to be restricted to specialists, but it's something which is available potentially to everyone who has a democratic interest.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds to me like it's more that those authors, the way you're explaining it, they don't really have that underlying goal of using the national interest for like expressing democratic political aspirations, right? It seems like it's in that sense perhaps more that they have a different, yeah, they want to achieve something different with the national interests
Yeah,
than you see it as having also
yeah.
these like potentials for expressing mass democratic politics. And
So, yeah, so
yeah,
when I see it as instrumental, but I see it as at the same time, it simply becomes a framework. It's for how we think about what any given set of people want within a state. So if this is in the national interest, is something it's instrumental in the sense that it is a prop to another goal, but at the same time, it becomes a way of effectively doing politics together in a way that has been made impossible by globalization.
right. Um, Great. So I think maybe this is a good time to sort of segue into um, like the potential and the potential pitfalls, perhaps, of the politics of the national interests in the contemporary moment. And I mentioned earlier that I did want to get back to your discussion of like, the Cold War and how during the Cold War, the national interest was kind of vitiated and just became the province of military planners, bureaucrats, the national security state. And I'm wondering, if you also see if you think that's a danger that this will happen again in our current moment, geopolitical instability. And in particular, I was just perusing the national security strategy that the White House released last month. And there is this section which is literally titled Focused Definition of the National Interest. And it states, quote, since at least the end of the Cold War, administrations have often published national security strategies that seek to expand the definition of America's national interest, such that almost no issue or endeavor is considered outside its scope. But to focus on everything is to focus on nothing. America's core national security interests shall be our focus. And I thought that was fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, in the beginning, that rhetoric also kind of resonates, I think, with some of the critiques that like class unity and we might have of a left that has sort of like no desire to actually like formulate like clear strategic priorities, and to sort of just like want, everything in without being able to sort of like formulate like what is the most important strategic priority. At the same time, it's like very clearly that they are saying, okay, the national interest, that's just core national security interests. Like right then and there, they're kind of like doing that sort of uh, that trick where they just turn the national interest into basically the preserve the interest of the national security state. So, I mean, I guess the question is just like, I'd like to hear you kind of like talk about that and whether you think this is a serious danger in the current moment.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think yes, there certainly is a complicity or a more than just a accidental resemblance, like you say, between the globalist formulation of American policy that the Trumpists are critiquing, and the way in which the left saw itself in that period as well. Like you say, this inability to strategically rank, the inability to prioritize, the lack of reference to any particular jurisdiction, everything, everywhere at the same time. Like the name of that movie, whatever it was, a similar kind of phenomenon, and that speaks to the politics of globalization. I think so in America, in the case of European states, the all the effort was focused on repressing independent nationhood. as intrinsically dangerous and potentially fascistic. In the case of America, the interests of the American national interest becomes immediately the interests of the world at large. I think that's what happened in the era of globalization. So in Europe, they're kind of repressing. In America, it simply kind of dissolves out from the side and becomes at one the interests of the American state. In the era of globalization, are simultaneously they become representatives. They claim de facto representation of the world at large rather than the American people, the American nation. And so, given and obviously when this enormously kind of hubristic and imperial vision begins to fray at the edges and becomes incredibly costly and unsustainable, they gave an opening for the populist critique that Trump represented, where he began to demand that he said these elites have betrayed your interests, the interests of the American people. So they opened themselves up to that, and he's made hay with it. I would say that there is, notwithstanding how precisely that part of the document is formulated, and how accurate and true it is in terms of its critique of the last 30 years, there is a limit, I think, to the populist critique of the national interest, because by their nature, or by its nature as a political phenomenon, I think populism is anti-representative. It doesn't see itself as creating or seeing the need for creating new institutions of civic life and public representation. It simply sees the problem as an elite that needs ejecting, and then you simply, everything is fine. You don't need to worry about anything else. And you have these charismatic demagogues who, through some mysterious process, just channel and embody the popular will, and therefore you don't have any need for really rebuilding institutions of representation, for new political parties, for new political processes. So for the moment, the populists, I think it's already obvious they're kind of fumbling the national interest. And this may well, if there is a regime change operation in Caracas, this may well be the moment in which it happens, that fumbling of the national interest, that they miss their opportunity to actually deliver what they claimed they were going to do. And you see a similar fumbling of the national interest among populists elsewhere in the Western world as well. So that, I think, gives an opportunity that the only real cogent possibility for democratic critique of populism is that Democrats seize the national interest and they use it to hold the populists to account. You failed. You said you stood for these things, but it's not enough just to have some loudmouth kind of brashly striding across the world, kind of throwing off random tweets. That isn't a national interest. There's an example where what did Trump do? He cancelled, I think, new trade talks with the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney after he heard that the Canadians ran an ad quoting Ronald Reagan about the benefits of free trade as opposed to tariffs. And Trump was so enraged by this that he kind of broke off the trade talks by the Canadians, kind of undercutting his claim to be the inheritor of Reaganism and the inheritor of the grand old party. And that's not the national interest, that's the personal interest, or the national interest is personal vanity. Obviously it's in the national interest that America continue trade talks with Canada, and that it would be responsible and a serious political leader would rise above the pettiness of whatever domestic advertising a friendly government engages in. They would look beyond that to their country's national interest. So there is plenty of scope, I think, for critique of the populists. On the deeper question of whether or not the deep state can reconstitute itself to seize back the national interest, it's possible. The reason it's a genuine threat. So it is vital, I think, that the national interest, that all Democrats seize the national interest and stride with it as far as they possibly can to kind of take as much terrain as they can before creepy deep staters begin to feel their way back to it and begin kind of surreptitiously annexing that political terrain again. But the reason I think they might not be able to do it is because the way in which national interest became conflated with national security was part of the bloc politics of the Cold War. when you had the nation became the idea of the nation became absorbed into these larger political collectivities like the West or the free world in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so it's in that period where the nation becomes boosted up into these larger kind of political collectivities, that the national interest becomes petrified in this larger political group. And then by the end of the Cold War, it just kind of disintegrates away. The West or the free world becomes the international community, and the national interest that was this thing for, deep state planners in the Cold War, and then simply kind of disappears along the way, and it becomes the interest of the international community at large. So I think the West is over, the political West, at least. That's over. And if the rumors of this covert kind of classified section of Trump's national security strategy are true, that he wants to set up this so-called Core Five group, a C5 group that combines the US, Japan, India, China, and Russia, that means, this political directorate for management of world affairs that no longer includes the West. Um, that means that bloc politics in which the national interests of all these countries are lined up and locked in place in these kind of bureaucratic supranational structures, NATO, the UN, the EU, and its precursors, that era is gone. And so I think the way in which Trump has broken up the old international order, and he has forced all of these questions onto states by virtue, they kind of cascaded downwards and crumbled downwards from the top. And so it'll be very difficult, I think, for there to be a process by which the national interest becomes associated with national security in the same way, because it'll be much, by definition, it will have to require more political fluidity, more political flexibility to seize on advantages. If you're France or Germany or Italy, you're not going to be a member of this core five group. If you're locked up in these larger political structures that limit your flexibility, it's going to be very difficult to act on your national interest. And so the pressure to break with these larger obligations and to carve out an independent path is going to become greater over time. And it'll be more difficult for bureaucracies at the state level to justify what they want to do by reference to this kind of the bureaucratic demands of a long-term 50-year alliance like NATO, because that's gone. So political elites, if they want to take advantage of the New World Order, they will need nimbleness, which has been lacking in world affairs for a long time. And that nimbleness will require them to cultivate an idea of national interest that will need democratic input from below and a mandate from below that will give scope, I hope, to the voters. So if the voters cling tight to the national interest and use it, like I say, to kind of keep on taking territory from political elites, then I think the logic of the way in which world order is fragmenting and being reconstituted, those two forces, I think, should give plenty of scope for the national interest to remain a vital part of democratic life for the foreseeable future, and that it won't be frozen and locked up in the national security state the way that it was in the 1950s and the post-war era.
That was great, and really kind of preempted some of my last question as well. I think it's just to maybe kind of make the point a little more concrete. It seems to me that what we see going on, looking just in the case of the United States, is that you do have a sort of fracturing of the MAGA coalition as a result of the crazy actions that the Trump administration is taking in terms of barreling towards regime change in Venezuela, just like funding the Israeli war machine, and you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson who are sort of explicitly saying, like, using that language of national interest to say, like, no, these policies are not in the national interests, and also to say we should focus more on things like healthcare affordability, housing, so on and so forth. So, I mean, just to me, it seemed like Well, do you see this as a vindication then of your argument in terms of just framing policies in terms of the national interest would then open up space for political elites to be held to account for their actions that are not clear, they're clearly not in the national interest, even because we see Trump constantly either trying to present his view as the national interest or to just he's super transactional. So just like any particular sectional, like narrow interest, like someone who gives them, money or whatever, well, that's going to be the national interest.
Yes,
So
yes.
because he's using that language, like it's possible to hold him to account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say even more to the point, then, the national interest shouldn't be left to the Taylor Greens and the Tucker Carlsons. That it has to be that,
Sure.
that has to be kind of wedged open by anyone who has a interest in the democratic future of the United States, and indeed the world. But I also, I'd agree with you that I think historians will see um, the all the controversy of the Gaza war, and in particular that Trump was able to put, notwithstanding the support the Trump administration has given to Netanyahu, Trump nonetheless was able to put more pressure on Netanyahu than the Biden administration ever was. And in so doing, I think they changed the quality of the US-Israel relationship and made it more transactional, more based on national interest rather than on some uh, ideological commitment that was above and beyond national interest, an identification, a political identification that was deeper than the national interest. So I think the fraying of that relationship speaks to the fact that the national interest is emerging in American life in powerful and important ways. Reconstituting a political alliance that has been so integral to America's foreign policy for so long. That is a marker of tremendous changes, and again, one that could be fruitfully exploited, and I think to some extent is being exploited. Um, that said, I mean, most of the critique, though, from the left has been in terms of a moral critique that international law needs to be observed and there's a humanitarian emergency in Gaza rather than in terms of the national interest. But it was because Trump's positions were cast in terms of national interest that he had more leeway to maneuver and to put pressure on Netanyahu in a way that simply casting the problems in or casting the critique in moral or humanitarian terms was never going to give them the same leeway, right? Because the whole basis, the the claim the Israelis make to legitimacy for their own actions is equally moral and humanitarian, right? And the need to avert a new Holocaust, the foundation of the Israeli state is on the basis of genocide, and so that debate was locked up fighting over that same terrain, whereas Trump, I think, by shifting it to the national interest, managed to break the logjam in the US-Israeli relationship. And whether or not that can be taken further, is up to subsequent generations of American citizens, I suppose, who are vested in America's foreign policy in the region and in America's national interest. But yes, I think what we're seeing is that it is incumbent on all Democrats to seize the national interest as tightly as possible and to wield it, to use it. My hope is, as a political weapon, something which you use in order to claim what you want within your own country rather than claiming it from, for the world on behalf of humanity at large. And that seems to be a much more effective prescription for political life.
Well, thanks, Phil. I know that we're kind of moving to the end of the time we have with you today, but I was just really struck by some of your comments there, and I just want to say to listeners, this is a really great book to check out. I really do think there's a lot in here for everyone, and I think also I would just recommend your various podcast appearances that you've been doing, both on your own show, on Angela Nagel's show, where you go into some of the sort of more historical aspects of what you've been discussing today. But I feel like I can't quite let you go without maybe trying to flesh this out with you if you've got a few seconds more, Phil. Because as you were talking there, I was thinking, I feel this book connects very well with an American audience that's concerned with how Trump is symptomatic of an anti-political moment, and I see the traction that your argument can have for that American audience. I do. Nevertheless, as I hear you talking about Israel, I'm also thinking, like, isn't Israel maybe like one of the few countries on earth that actually does have a very developed sense of the national interest right now? And I don't mean I mean precisely in the way that you're describing, not as a thing, although I think it has become thingified in Israel, but as a process. If the national interest is a metric for how politics is doing in a country, you can see in the United States it's not doing very well, and this allows an executive like Trump to come into place and for the vicissitudes of his state of mind day to day to shape what's going on in terms of the planning around the war in Venezuela, for example. And we're all eager to say, I have no crystal ball, but I mean, my sense is that Trump will not go into Venezuela. I'm going to eat my words tomorrow, or because he may well change his mind. But based on my sense of it, I think they're just here for show. They'll bomb some things. It'll be very much like Iran earlier on this year. It'll be bad, but it won't be, shall we say, existential. I think Maduro will survive. Again, I'll be proven extremely wrong on this, no doubt. But that's my sense. Nevertheless, when the weakness in the articulation of a national interest in the United States is the issue we're in agreement on. Whereas I don't know that I would say that Israel has necessarily played the liberal card in getting to the point where it's at. Maybe you disagree. I'd be fascinated to hear your answer. I think Israel maybe is one of the few countries on earth that does have a developed sense of the national interest right now. And I don't mean that in any complimentary sense, by the way, but I just analytically, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so I mean, I would disagree.
Okay, good.
I think in the kind of era of high globalization, only rogue states as defined by the West, countries like Iran, North Korea, would be the only ones really who would have a national interest, which would be something where they'd be forced to carve out an independent foreign policy stance because they were, for whatever reason, targeted by the West for their recalcitrance and whatever. And even then, you would say these kind of brittle and deeply authoritarian regimes would also fail to represent their people effectively. So even then, you could kind of cast doubt on how far they expressed a legitimate national interest. In the case of Israel, the reason I disagree is because I think it seemed for two reasons. So it seems to me the claim of Israel that the powerful claim for Israel is that of the victim state, that it's founded by people who fled the Holocaust, and that this gives Israel kind of existential license in a way that other countries don't enjoy, and a kind of a deeper moral claim on the loyalty and support of countries around the world in a way that goes beyond any ordering nation state. And that the claim is ultimately humanitarian. It's to avert the possibility of genocide, that Israel exists and that Israel is entitled to do all of these terrible things, is to avert that possibility. And that seems to me to be fighting, that's claiming the same terrain that many of the pro-Palestinian solidarity campaigns are also claiming, which is to say that there is a genocide being waged, they say, by Israel against the Palestinians. And so the whole debate is centered on claims of international morality, who holds the higher claim to be the more debased victim, or the victim that's more deserving of sympathy and support, and the victim that has more license to do terrible things in order to defend themselves. And that seems to me to go beyond national interest. And then if you think about the way Netanyahu has conducted the war, everything seems to point to the fact that he has done it in order to avoid being embroiled. He's kept on, extending the forever war in order to avoid being embroiled in his all the corruption allegations that are, kind of constantly resurfacing. And he has tried to maintain his position in power. And that, again, seems to me to cut against any meaningful sense of Israel's national interest. And the other third element, I think, is the fact that Israel doesn't seem to be able to cash in any of these stupendous military victories. So all of these tremendous military accomplishments don't seem to congeal into any kind of stable political settlement that puts Israel in a on a surer long-term footing, at least at the moment. And so that seems to me, that's ideological. That's the when you hear all the insane kind of far right members of the Israeli government talking about Old Testament prophecy, why that legitimates doing all the things they're doing. That seems to me to be very far from any cogent national interest. So I think Israel is, it's an exemplar of a country, in fact, that is not behaving in any way that I think the national interest you would hope for and expect more strategic coherence, more evidence of rationality, more instrumental rather than existential or expressive violence, and less justification on the grounds of international morality.
Right. It's
Uh,
just,
so,
you talk a lot about how you're not being prescriptive with this concept. You're not trying to fill it with a content, right? You're talking about it more as a process than a thing. And so, when I think about realism and I think about the priority it assigns to survival in anarchy, it bleeds a little over into this question of genocide, right? Like, isn't genocide one of the most existential kind of things you can possibly think of? And this might be a question for another day, so I don't want to necessarily keep you. But
yeah, I mean, it certainly does, I suppose. But I mean, in the case of Israel, it's got everyone, according to what everyone, obviously the Israelis don't admit it, but
Mhm.
everyone believes Israelis have a second nuclear strike capability. Their political independence is guaranteed. Their security is guaranteed as an independent nation. So the notion that they're fighting, constantly refighting wars on the grounds of on existential grounds just doesn't, just doesn't hold water.
I
So
agree.
that
I
doesn't,
agree.
Yeah,
Just to be clear,
I,
to anyone listening,
I,
no, no, sure. I
I
mean,
mean,
I'm sure we do.
devil's advocate here.
No,
yeah, and I
absolutely. Yeah.
mean, we don't really have time to go into this, but I think this also might have to do with, its character as fundamentally an ethno state. I mean, like that's how Israel is fundamentally like kind of defines itself as an ethno state, a
Can't
state for
ethnostates have a
Jewish
national
people.
interest?
So
Yes, I think that's right as well. That would be an important part of it, and we haven't had a chance to go into it. But um, I think part of the appeal and significance of the national interest is precisely to rise above the ethno-nationalism that is now beginning to roil, Western politics. Is that ethno-nationalism is not in the national interest? Very evidently, that we need kind of democratic, inclusive nations that draw on the legitimacy and democratic power of all of their people.
Mm.
And so that allows us to rise above ethno-nationalism. That is my hope with the national interest as well. And so, as you say, by those grounds as well, Israel's increasing recourse to Jewish supremacism as the basis of its identity doesn't bode well for Israel as a exponent of national interest politics.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Well, that seems as good a place as any to end it. Philip Cunliffe, thank you so much for joining us today and for taking the time to discuss this very, very provocative book. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for such fantastic questions and for giving me the opportunity to reply at length. I've enjoyed it tremendously, and thanks also for playing devil's advocate as well.
Your Twitter and stuff, or your whatever we're calling that now. It's the Philippics, right?
The Philippics, yeah, on X, Twitter, whatever.
Very good. All right, folks. Hopefully, we'll have Phil back again for more discussion on this topic in the not too distant future. Thanks, everyone.